On a warm September morning in 1974, a young father excitedly packs the truck for a camping trip, while his wife makes sandwiches in the kitchen. Their 5-year-old son can barely contain his excitement about sleeping under the stars, and in the corner, their sleepy 5-month-old baby girl dreams peacefully. Little do they know, this trip into the Oregon wilderness will take a dark turn, leading to one of America's most unsettling unsolved mysteries. Richard Cowden was 28 years old in September 1974, a hard-working truck driver who lived with his family in White City, Oregon. He was the kind of man who believed in simple pleasures, spending time with his wife Belinda, teaching his son David about the outdoors, and watching his baby daughter Melissa discover the world around her. Belinda was 22, full of life, and devoted to her young family. David, their 5-year-old son, had inherited his father's love for adventure, always eager to explore and ask endless questions about everything he saw. And then there was Melissa, just 5 months old, a tiny bundle of joy who had brought new light into their home. The Cowdens hadn't originally planned to go camping that Labor Day weekend of 1974. Richard had been working long hours driving his logging truck through the winding mountain roads of southern Oregon, and Belinda had been busy caring for their infant daughter. But as the long weekend approached, they decided that a family camping trip would be the perfect way to reconnect and enjoy the beautiful Oregon wilderness together. They packed their gear, loaded up their truck, and set off for the Siskiyou Mountains near Copper, Oregon, a small mining town that would later be submerged when Applegate Lake was created. The family wasn't traveling alone on this adventure. They brought along their beloved basset hound, Droopy, a gentle dog who was as much a part of the family as anyone else. Droopy had been David's constant companion, following the boy everywhere with the patient devotion that only a good dog can provide. The dog's presence would later become a crucial piece in the puzzle of what happened to the Cowdens. On September 1, 1974, the family arrived at their chosen campsite in the Rogue River National Forest, nestled in the scenic Siskiyou Mountains. The area was known for its breathtaking beauty, tall pine trees stretching toward the sky, crystal-clear streams winding through the forest, and mountain air so fresh it seemed to wash away all the worries of everyday life. For Richard and Belinda, this was exactly what they needed: time away from work pressures and household responsibilities, time to focus on each other and their children. The campsite they chose was remote, but not completely isolated. Other campers were scattered throughout the area, and the small town of Copper was just about a mile away. The town wasn't much: a general store, a few scattered buildings, and the remnants of what had once been a bustling mining community. But it was enough to provide supplies if needed, and the Copper General Store served as a gathering place for campers and locals alike. That first day of September was perfect for camping. The weather was warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze rustling through the pine trees. Richard set up their tent while Belinda arranged their supplies and kept an eye on baby Melissa. David explored the immediate area around their campsite, with Droopy never far from his side. It was the kind of day that creates the memories families treasure, forever simple, peaceful, and filled with love. As evening approached, the family settled into their camping routine. They cooked dinner over their campfire, the smell of food mixing with the scent of pine and wood smoke. David probably pestered his parents with questions about the forest animals they might see, while Melissa dozed in her mother's arms. Richard and Belinda likely talked about their plans for the next day, perhaps discussing a hike or a visit to one of the nearby streams. Droopy curled up near the fire, content to be wherever his family was. But something went wrong during the night or early morning hours of September 2nd. Something so terrible that it would haunt investigators and the local community for decades to come. When the Cowden family failed to return from their camping trip as scheduled, their relatives began to worry. Richard was a responsible man who always kept his word, and Belinda was devoted to her family's routines. When they didn't show up for a planned family dinner that Labor Day Monday, alarm bells began to ring. The extended family tried to convince themselves that maybe the Cowdens had simply decided to stay an extra day, or perhaps their truck had broken down and they were waiting for help. But as the hours passed, the worry grew into genuine fear. By September 3rd, family members could no longer ignore their concerns. They contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, reporting that Richard, Belinda, David, Melissa, and even their dog Droopy were missing from their campsite in the Siskiyou Mountains. The sheriff's deputies who responded to the call initially hoped they were dealing with a simple case of campers who had gotten lost or whose vehicle had broken down. But when they reached the campsite, they found something far more troubling. The Cowden family's campsite appeared to have been abandoned in haste. Their tent was still standing, and most of their camping equipment was still there, scattered around, as if the family had left suddenly. But there were signs that something was very wrong. The campfire was cold, suggesting it had been extinguished hours or even days earlier. More disturbing were the signs of what appeared to be a struggle, items scattered in ways that didn't make sense if the family had simply packed up to leave. Most puzzling of all was the family's truck. Richard's logging truck was gone from the campsite, which initially gave investigators hope that the family had simply driven somewhere, perhaps to get help or supplies. But why would they leave behind most of their camping gear? And why wouldn't they have contacted family members to let them know about any change in plans? These questions would drive the investigation that was about to begin. What followed was one of the largest search and rescue operations in Oregon's history. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office immediately mobilized every available resource, calling in search and rescue teams, volunteer firefighters, and even civilian volunteers who knew the area well. The rugged terrain of the Siskiyou Mountains presented enormous challenges for the searchers. The forest was dense in many areas, crossed by steep ravines and rocky outcroppings that could easily hide evidence or even people. Search teams fanned out across hundreds of square miles of wilderness, following every trail, checking every campsite, and calling out the family's names. The search included both ground teams and aircraft, with helicopters and small planes crisscrossing the mountains looking for any sign of the missing family. Local residents joined the effort, sharing their knowledge of the area's hidden trails, abandoned mine shafts, and remote cabins that might provide shelter. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of the Cowden family. Searchers found their truck about a week into the search, abandoned several miles from the original campsite. The discovery of the vehicle raised more questions than it answered. The truck appeared to have been driven deliberately to its location and then abandoned. There were no obvious signs of mechanical failure, no indication that it had been in an accident. It was as if someone had simply parked it there and walked away. The fact that the truck had been found miles from the campsite suggested that the family had left their camping spot, but it didn't explain why they would abandon their vehicle in such a remote location. Had they been fleeing from something or someone? Had they been forced to leave the truck behind? Or was there some other explanation that investigators weren't seeing? As the search continued, the theories began to multiply. Some believed the family had gotten lost in the dense forest and were waiting for rescue, surviving on whatever food and water they could find. Others worried that they had encountered a dangerous person or group of people who had harmed them. There were even suggestions that Richard, under some unknown stress, might have harmed his own family, though those who knew him rejected this idea completely. The searching became more desperate as autumn arrived in the mountains. The weather was beginning to turn colder, especially at night, and everyone knew that if the family was still alive somewhere in the wilderness, they would be in increasing danger from exposure. Volunteers worked longer hours, pushing deeper into the most remote areas of the forest. But as September turned into October and October into November, hope began to fade. The media attention surrounding the case was intense. Newspapers throughout Oregon and beyond carried daily updates about the search efforts. Television news crews traveled to the search area, interviewing family members, investigators, and volunteers. The story of the missing Cowden family touched people throughout the region, and offers of help poured in from across the country. Psychics contacted authorities claiming to have visions about the family's location. Tips and reported sightings came in from throughout the Pacific Northwest, each one investigated thoroughly despite the strain on resources. But winter was approaching, and the harsh mountain weather made searching increasingly difficult and dangerous. Snow began to fall in the higher elevations, covering potential evidence and making travel through the forest treacherous. Reluctantly, officials were forced to scale back the active search, though they continued to follow up on tips and reported sightings. The case remained open and active, but the massive coordinated search effort had to be suspended. For the Cowden family's relatives and friends, the waiting was agonizing. They organized their own search parties when weather permitted, never giving up hope that Richard, Belinda, David, and Melissa might still be found alive. They put up flyers with the family's photographs, distributed throughout Oregon and neighboring states. They gave interviews to anyone who would listen, keeping the story in the public eye and hoping someone, somewhere, might have information that could help solve the mystery. The months dragged by with no answers. Christmas came and went without the Cowden family, leaving empty chairs at holiday gatherings and presents that would never be opened. David's 6th birthday passed in March with no celebration, just the quiet grief of relatives who wondered if the little boy was still alive somewhere, growing older in circumstances they couldn't bear to imagine. Baby Melissa would have been learning to walk, beginning to say her first words, reaching all those milestones that parents treasure. But there was no one there to witness her progress, except perhaps those who had taken her from her family. Then, on a spring day in April 1975, nearly 7 months after the family had disappeared, a group of hunters made a discovery that would answer some questions while raising many others. Deep in the forest, approximately 7 miles from the original campsite, they found human remains. The location was remote, hidden in a wooded area near Carberry Creek in what was then Copper, California, just across the state line from Oregon. The discovery was heartbreaking, but also brought a mixture of relief and renewed anguish to the family's relatives. After months of not knowing, of hoping against hope that their loved ones might still be alive, they finally had an answer to the question of the Cowdens' fate. But the answer was the one they had most feared. All 4 members of the Cowden family were found together: Richard, Belinda, 5-year-old David, and baby Melissa. Even their faithful dog Droopy was with them, having stayed loyal to his family until the very end. The scene where they were discovered told a story of violence that investigators found difficult to process, even in their line of work. The medical examiner's findings revealed the horrific truth of what had happened to this innocent family. Belinda and 5-year-old David had been killed by gunshot wounds from a .22 caliber weapon. 5-month-old Melissa had died from severe blunt force trauma to the head, a detail so brutal that it was difficult for investigators to discuss, even among themselves. Richard's cause of death could not be determined due to the advanced state of decomposition of his remains, but there was no doubt that he too had been murdered. The location where the bodies were found suggested that the family had been taken from their campsite and driven to this remote area, where they were killed and their bodies left hidden in the forest. The fact that their truck had been found miles away from both the campsite and the location of their remains suggested a deliberate effort to confuse investigators and delay the discovery of the bodies. But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail was the way the family was found. They were together, suggesting that even in their final moments, they had not been separated. Richard and Belinda had died trying to protect their children. 5-year-old David had died beside his parents and baby sister. Even Droopy, the family dog, had remained with them, refusing to abandon his beloved family even when doing so might have saved his own life. The discovery of the bodies transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into a quadruple homicide inquiry. Investigators now knew that they were looking for a killer, someone who had committed one of the most heinous crimes in Oregon's history. The brutality of the murders, especially the killing of the children, shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. This appeared to be a calculated act of evil. The investigation into the murders was intensive and thorough, but it was also hampered by the amount of time that had passed between the killings and the discovery of the bodies. 7 months of exposure to the elements, wildlife, and natural decomposition had destroyed much of the physical evidence that might have pointed to the killer. The crime scene, if it could even be called that after such a long time, yielded few clues about what had happened or who was responsible. Investigators worked tirelessly to reconstruct the family's final days and hours. They interviewed everyone who had been in the area during that Labor Day weekend of 1974. They spoke with other campers, local residents, store clerks, and anyone else who might have seen the Cowden family or noticed anything unusual during that time period. They carefully examined the family's truck for fingerprints, hair, fibers, or any other evidence that might identify their killer. They analyzed the bullets that had killed Belinda and David, hoping to match them to a specific weapon. But the investigation was challenging from the start. The remote location where the family had been camping meant that there were few witnesses to any unusual activity. The rugged terrain made it easy for someone to move through the area without being seen. And the passage of 7 months before the bodies were discovered meant that crucial evidence had been lost forever. Despite these challenges, investigators began to develop theories about what had happened. The fact that the family's camping equipment had been left behind at their original site suggested that they had been taken from their campsite, either by force or under false pretenses. The killer or killers had then driven the family in their own truck to the remote location where they were murdered, before abandoning the vehicle and presumably making their escape on foot or in another vehicle. The brutality of the murders suggested someone with a deeply disturbed mind, someone capable of killing not just adults, but also a 5-year-old boy and a 5-month-old baby. The use of different methods to kill different family members, gunshots for Belinda and David, blunt force trauma for baby Melissa, suggested a killer who was not only violent, but also cruelly methodical. Over the months and years that followed, investigators pursued numerous leads and suspects. They looked into the possibility that the family had been killed by someone they knew, perhaps someone with a grudge against Richard or Belinda. They investigated whether the murders might have been connected to Richard's work as a truck driver, wondering if he might have witnessed something or crossed paths with dangerous people in his travels. They even explored the possibility that the killings were random, committed by a drifter or serial killer who happened to encounter the family during their camping trip. One name that surfaced during the investigation was Dwayne Lee Little, a convicted killer who had been operating in the Pacific Northwest during the mid-1970s. Little was known to law enforcement as a dangerous criminal with a history of violence. He had been convicted of other murders in the region, and his pattern of criminal behavior included targeting victims in remote areas. Some investigators believed that Little might have been responsible for the Cowden family murders, but they were never able to gather enough evidence to prove his involvement. The case against Little was largely circumstantial. He had been in the general area during the time period when the Cowdens were killed, and his criminal history showed that he was capable of the kind of violence that had been inflicted on the family. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the specific murders, no witnesses who could place him at the scene, and no confession or admission of guilt. Without more concrete evidence, prosecutors could not charge him with the Cowden murders. As years passed, the case grew cold. New investigators took over from those who had worked on it originally. Technology improved, offering new ways to analyze old evidence, but the passage of time had already destroyed much of what might have been useful. The .22 caliber bullets that had killed Belinda and David were preserved, but without a weapon to match them to, they could only confirm what was already known, that the family had been murdered. The Cowden family murders became one of Oregon's most notorious unsolved cases, joining the ranks of mysteries that haunt law enforcement and the public imagination. True crime enthusiasts studied the case, proposing their own theories about what had happened and who might have been responsible. Amateur investigators combed through old reports and evidence, hoping to spot something that the professionals had missed. But despite all the attention and analysis, the identity of the killer remained unknown. For the extended Cowden family and their friends, the lack of closure was a continuing source of pain. They had buried their loved ones, but they had never been able to see justice done for the horrible crimes that had taken Richard, Belinda, David, and Melissa from them. The knowledge that somewhere out there, the person or people responsible for these murders might still be alive and free was a burden they carried every day. The case also had a lasting impact on the local community. The Siskiyou Mountains had long been a popular destination for campers, hikers, and outdoor enthusiasts. The murders cast a shadow over the area, making people more cautious about camping in remote locations and more aware of their vulnerability in the wilderness. What had once seemed like a peaceful retreat from the stresses of modern life now carried an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. Over the decades, the case has been revisited numerous times by investigators, journalists, and true crime researchers. New suspects have been proposed, old evidence has been re-examined with modern technology, and witnesses have been re-interviewed. But despite all these efforts, the murders remain unsolved. Some investigators believe that the person responsible for the Cowden murders committed other crimes as well, possibly including other unsolved murders in the Pacific Northwest during the 1970s. The brutality and methodical nature of the killings suggests someone with experience in violence, someone who might have killed before and perhaps killed again. But connecting the Cowden case to other unsolved murders requires more than just similarities in method or location. It requires concrete evidence that has so far proven elusive. The passage of nearly 50 years since the murders has created additional challenges for anyone hoping to solve the case. Many of the original investigators have retired or passed away, taking with them their first-hand knowledge of the investigation and their insights into potential suspects. Witnesses from that Labor Day weekend in 1974 have also aged, and their memories of events from so long ago may no longer be reliable. Even if someone had information that could solve the case, they might not remember it clearly enough to be useful. But perhaps the most significant challenge is that the person or people responsible for the murders may no longer be alive. If Dwayne Lee Little or another suspect from that era was indeed the killer, they may have died years ago, taking the truth about the Cowden murders to their grave. This possibility is particularly frustrating for investigators and family members, as it would mean that justice for Richard, Belinda, David, and Melissa might never be achieved. Despite these challenges, investigators have never officially closed the case. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office continues to maintain an open file on the Cowden murders, and new tips or information are still investigated when they arise. Modern forensic techniques that didn't exist in 1974 offer hope that someday evidence from the crime might yield new clues about the killer's identity. DNA analysis, in particular, has revolutionized criminal investigations, and there's always a possibility that genetic material preserved from the crime scene might eventually lead to a breakthrough. The story of the Cowden family murders is more than just a criminal case. It's a tragedy that destroyed 4 innocent lives and forever changed the people who loved them. Richard Cowden was a young man with his whole life ahead of him, working hard to provide for his family and enjoying the simple pleasure of sharing the outdoors with his children. Belinda was a young mother devoted to her husband and babies, probably dreaming about watching her daughter grow up and giving her more siblings to play with David. 5-year-old David was just beginning to discover the world around him, full of questions and wonder about everything he saw. That camping trip should have been filled with memories of teaching him to identify different trees, showing him how to safely tend a campfire, and listening to his excited chatter about all the new things he was learning. Instead, his young life was cut short in a way that no child should ever experience. Baby Melissa was just 5 months old when she died, barely old enough to smile at her parents or recognize their faces. She would never take her first steps, speak her first words, or experience any of the joys that should have been her birthright as a beloved daughter. Her life was snuffed out before she had a chance to live it, a tragedy that is almost impossible to comprehend. Even Droopy, the family's faithful basset hound, became a victim of this senseless crime. The dog's loyalty to his family cost him his life, but it also serves as a testament to the love that bound this family together. Droopy could have run away when danger threatened. He could have hidden in the forest and probably survived, but he stayed with the people he loved, sharing their fate because he couldn't bear to abandon them. The impact of these murders extended far beyond the immediate family. Richard and Belinda's parents lost their children and grandchildren in one horrific act of violence. Siblings lost brothers and sisters they would never see again. Friends lost people they cared about, and an entire community lost a sense of security and innocence. The case has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and articles over the years. Each retelling brings the story to new audiences, keeping alive the hope that someone, somewhere, might have information that could finally solve the mystery. Sometimes these retellings generate new tips or prompt someone to come forward with information they've kept secret for decades. But more often, they serve as a reminder of the human cost of unsolved crimes and the ongoing pain experienced by families who never get justice for their loved ones. What makes the Cowden murders particularly haunting is the randomness of the crime. This wasn't a family involved in dangerous activities or criminal behavior. They weren't wealthy people targeted for their money, nor were they involved in disputes that might have motivated someone to harm them. They were simply an ordinary family who decided to go camping and had the misfortune to cross paths with evil in the wilderness. This randomness is perhaps what makes the case so terrifying and so compelling to those who study unsolved crimes. It represents every family's worst nightmare, the fear that something terrible could happen to you or your loved ones through no fault of your own, simply because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's a reminder that evil exists in the world and that sometimes, despite our best efforts to stay safe, we can become its victims. The Cowden family murders also highlight the challenges of seeking justice in cases where evidence is limited and time works against investigators. Unlike crimes that occur in urban areas with multiple witnesses and extensive surveillance systems, wilderness murders often leave few clues and fewer people who might have seen something relevant. The isolation that makes wilderness areas appealing for recreation also makes them appealing to those who want to commit crimes without being detected. As we approach the 50th anniversary of the murders, the case remains as puzzling as ever. Modern investigative techniques offer some hope for new breakthroughs, but they cannot overcome the fundamental challenge of a case where so much time has passed and so little physical evidence was preserved. The bullets that killed Belinda and David, the crime scene where the bodies were found, and the family's abandoned truck have all been examined and re-examined countless times, but they have yet to yield the answers that would identify the killer. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the case is imagining what the Cowden family's lives might have been like if they had never encountered their killer that September morning in 1974. Richard and Belinda would likely have had more children, watching David grow up to become a big brother and helping Melissa take her first steps. They might have continued camping as a family tradition, teaching their children to love the outdoors and creating memories that would have lasted a lifetime. David would have started school that fall, learning to read and write, making friends, and discovering his own interests and talents. He might have followed in his father's footsteps and become interested in trucks and heavy machinery, or he might have developed completely different passions. Melissa would have grown from a baby into a little girl, then a teenager, then a young woman with her own dreams and aspirations. The family might have eventually included grandchildren, extending the Cowden name to future generations. Richard and Belinda would have grown old together, sharing the joys and challenges of watching their children become adults and start families of their own. They would have celebrated anniversaries, birthdays, graduations, and weddings. They would have lived the full, rich lives that were stolen from them in those mountains in 1974. Instead, their story ended in violence and tragedy, leaving behind only memories, photographs, and an unsolved mystery that has haunted law enforcement and the public for nearly half a century. The case file remains open, a reminder that justice for Richard, Belinda, David, and Melissa has never been achieved. But perhaps there's still hope. Perhaps somewhere in the evidence that has been preserved, or in the memories of someone who was in those mountains that Labor Day weekend, there are clues that could still solve this case. Perhaps advances in forensic technology will eventually reveal information that wasn't accessible in 1974 or 1975. Perhaps someone who has kept a secret for decades will finally find the courage to come forward. Until then, the Cowden family murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. 4 innocent lives were lost, a family was destroyed, and a killer walked free. Justice delayed is justice denied, and for the Cowden family, justice has been delayed for far too long. The mountains where the Cowdens died are still beautiful. The Siskiyou wilderness still draws campers and hikers who want to experience the peace and solitude of nature. Applegate Lake, created after the murders, now covers the old town of Copper, where the family made their last stop at the general store. But those who know the story of the Cowden family can't help but feel a chill when they think about what happened in those mountains in September 1974. And in the end, perhaps that's the most tragic aspect of this case. A place of natural beauty, where a family went to create happy memories and strengthen their bonds with each other, became the setting for one of the most senseless and brutal crimes in Oregon's history. The wilderness that should have offered the Cowden family peace and respite instead became the place where their lives ended, and their story became a mystery that may never be solved. The Cowden family murders remind us that evil can strike anywhere, at any time, and that sometimes the questions it raises are never answered. They remind us to cherish the time we have with our loved ones, because we never know when tragedy might steal them away. And they remind us that there are still people out there fighting for justice, still hoping that someday, somehow, the truth about what happened to Richard, Belinda, David, and Melissa Cowden will finally come to light. But perhaps the most important reminder of all is that behind every unsolved case, behind every statistic about violent crime, there are real people who were loved and who are still missed. The Cowden family wasn't just 4 victims of an unsolved murder. They were a husband and wife who loved each other, parents who adored their children, and children who trusted their parents to keep them safe. They were a family, and 50 years later, they still deserve justice.